Planning a wedding and feeling overwhelmed? Simply Eloped makes it easy. With over 14,000 elopements and vow renewals planned and 37 stunning U.S. destinations, the planners at Simply Eloped have you covered. Their all-inclusive packages connect you with over 700 top-tier vendors, cutting stress, cost, and complexity. And no two packages are alike because they customize it for you. Your story deserves ease. Let them handle the hard stuff. You just show up and say, I do. Start at simplyeloped.com. Today on City Cast D.C. It's almost 2026, and as always, City Cast D.C.'s New Year's resolution is to learn more about this city that we all love so much. That's why we're revisiting our conversation about the history and hidden vibrancy of H Street. CityCast contributor Austin Graff and tour guide Kate Denson joined to give us the ultimate guide to H Street. Today's Monday, December 29th. I'm Bridget Todd, and here's what DC is talking about. Kate, Austin, thank you so much both for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So for folks who might not know, where exactly is H Street?
So H Street it's technically in a neighborhood called Near Northeast, and it is the main commercial area. So if you know where Capitol Hill is, which is the most populous neighborhood in DC, it's just north of Capitol Hill and Hill East.
I've lived in DC for so long. I remember when the neighborhood really started popping off. What is some of the history of that area?
I think it goes way back, and then there's sort of more recent. So in the way back, a lot of the origins of H Street have to do with the building of the U.S. Capitol. So the community of people that built the U.S. Capitol were people who were enslaved, who'd been what was called hired out at the time, often by nearby enslavers and plantations all over, I guess, what would have been Virginia and Maryland and upcoming D.C. at that time, along with a lot of lower income European immigrants. I think particularly a lot of Irish people. And so that community of people were living just northeast, maybe, of the U.S. Capitol, where the U.S. Capitol is today, in an area that they called Swampoodle, for the swamps and puddles of the Tiber Creek. And so that community of people were pushed out in order to build Union Station in the early 1900s. So that was built, I think, around 1907 or so. And then that community just really pushed east. And so from the beginning, 8th Street has been a pretty mixed community in terms of race, often working class folks. And that's kind of the beginning. So a lot of the early houses were built around 1910, 20, and 30. It was a big commercial district all through the 30s, through the 60s. It was one of the communities that was most impacted in the uprising after Martin Luther King was shot and killed in Memphis in 1968. And so in many ways went through like a dip after that time because a lot of businesses were closed for a really long time. And then the Atlas Theater opens back up in 2005. And that's kind of where we see a lot of the more recent history and interest in the area.
And Kate, I know that you're a tour guide. When you're giving tours of this area, are you pointing out remnants of the legacy that you were just talking about all the different communities that used to be in that area?
I started giving the tour I developed of H Street in 2013. It was the capstone for the walking tour class that I took. And I will say every single site that I had has changed since 2013. But in tour guiding, it's really important to have a visual. So it's not very helpful to say, at this place, there used to be, but you can't see it. And so even, for instance, right now there's a Nike store on H Street. But at one time, the Nike store had some graffiti that looked like Martin Luther King. And you could still see burned bricks. That was from 1968. Today, I don't stop and point out the Nike store where there used to be burnt. It's important for people to be able to engage with what is. And so I think that's what's challenging often about trying to tell history through the built environment, if the built environment changes a lot, because you want people to also be able to see and remember what they can see.
And I know that H Street, as you said, has really shifted. I remember when the first sort of wave of gentrification was really popping off in the area. What is H Street like now, today in 2025?
I think this area has such a unique history because of the Black community as well as the immigrant community. There's a lot of interesting stories of people really coming alongside each other historically. So, for example, like the block where Popeyes is currently, there used to be a store owned by a woman named Anna Schulman, who she actually helped. She herself was a Russian Jew and moved to DC. And she helped other immigrants with their paperwork, getting settled, even helped house them and gave them clothing and food. And so there's so many stories like that of people really kind of coming alongside each other. But fast forward to the last many years with different buildings going up and restaurants closing and opening, it really has that kind of, it's like many other neighborhoods that is trying to figure out what is the best path forward. And I do think there's some people of like goodwill trying to figure that out of how do you do that thoughtfully? And I don't think anyone knows kind of the right answer to go from there. But the current state of the neighborhood is a mix of people who are native to that neighborhood and as well as transplants, but also a number of people who moved to DC decades ago and have chosen to settle in that area and kind of be committed to it. And I think when you're committed to a place, hopefully you try to listen to your neighbors and kind of together figure out what the future is. But that tension point is still prevalent in that area. And it has been since I moved here 20 years ago.
New Year's plans are always tough. You don't want to go out and spend $5 bajillion to get into some stuffy, overcrowded club, but staying in isn't really an option. Look no further than the Black Cat New Year's Swing Ball. It's DC's most legendary and longest-running big band night, with non-stop music from Peaches O'Dell and her big band orchestra. Plus, games and fun for just $35. It is one of the best deals in town. No dress code and a relaxed atmosphere that caters to everyone. Grab your tickets at blackcatdc.com now. That's blackcatdc.com. I mean, speaking of those tension points, I do think of H Street as a place where all of these different kind of communities and stories and lives in DC all intersect. How has the neighborhood changed over time in your view?
I love the example of Anna Schulman. And there are other examples too, especially in Swampoodle. It was a pretty strong Catholic community because of the Irish immigrants that helped build the U.S. Capitol and other sites around the city. And there were some amazing examples. For example, there's this old site of the Little Sisters of the Poor, who actually are still around. They're just now in deeper into Northeast DC. But they really helped come alongside the elderly in the community, and they helped anyone of any race and background. And so I think it's easy to lose sight of those stories when you have big apartment buildings going up and people move into them just for a few years at a time and want to go to their Orange Theory gym along H Street and get coffee and enjoy the restaurants. And so that's why I think it's so important to really understand the history of a place so that you can neighbor better, hopefully, and listen and kind of be part of something larger than yourself versus just a cool place or trendy place to live. And so it looks very different because you have more and more big brands moving in. But if you look, there are still a lot of hyper local places.
I love how you put that. How does one neighbor well in H Street?
I think it depends on who you are. I would call myself a transplant, but I'm a committed transplant. I've lived in DC for nearly 20 years and intend for it to likely be my forever home. I will approach the question from my own perspective, but I also would say I have gotten to know, particularly through Douglas Methodist Church, which is on H Street, some folks who are in like their 80s still holding it down at that church. And we'll get together and they'll ask me questions about what do you think it means to be a good neighbor here? And they'll be sharing with me what they think it means to be a good neighbor here. And I think sometimes there can just be this broad stroke brush that says, the newcomers aren't paying attention. The old comers kind of don't want them there, and they feel like nothing but combative against one another. And that actually has not been what I've noticed. As I've met a lot of elderly folks in the community, I think maybe particularly like people of justice, people of faith, they want to see community across difference. And so these older folks are doing things like asking questions of how do we get young people to come into the church, and how do we care for the people who are unhoused on the street? And so they're really just trying to figure out what's hot, what's new, how do we get involved, what can we do to be more engaged in what's happening? And I think those are kind of forever neighborhood questions. I think as a person who I would say is of a more privileged identity coming onto a community like H Street, trying to get to know it as an outsider, I think for me, it's been a lot more about how do I show up with humility. I think there are a lot of things, particularly like the new gentrified businesses, seem like they were created for me when I was in my 20s. It's like, hey, young white person, you want to come hang out at some bars and just wear your cool clothes on a Saturday night and kind of forget everybody else who's lived there forever. I think maybe the move for someone like me in that situation is just to try to open my eyes to what doesn't seem like it's just for me. Like, what's the whole community? And who are the people maybe who are being left behind as this sort of new development is happening, that maybe their interests are not being considered? So that could be kids. It could be elderly people. It could be people who don't have disposable incomes to spend at restaurants and bars. And so I think a lot of it's just paying attention. It's learning the history, being willing to look at everybody when you walk down the street. And DC is a place where people greet each other. So even just simple things like looking people in the eye with a smile or a nod or a hello, I think goes a long way to just communicating that I'm here for this whole neighborhood, not just for the people that look like me.
Both of you have sort of spoken to this kind of obliquely, but, you know, when I was spending a lot of time on H Street, one of the things that I would hear often was like, oh, aren't you worried about crime? When businesses would close down, sometimes they would cite crime. Sometimes it feels like fear-mongering, or sometimes it feels like painting this kind of pretty vibrant community with a very wide brush. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And again, I think it applies to a lot of different areas. I think that there's always more to the story. And I think especially in intentionally exploring every single street and neighborhood of the city, that was really kind of the headline was, like some neighborhoods for so many reasons that experience more crime than other areas. But that isn't necessarily the headline, and it isn't the whole story either. And so you kind of have to like look for that. So with 8th Street, it's many blocks long. And so it is a big area. And of course, we're in a major city in this country and there is crime. And so you have to be mindful of that. But it is not the headline at all, because amidst that, it is not every day. And there's still a lot of great community gatherings that happen out in the open during the day and at night, and people can still walk and dine and feel safe. But I do think it's also really important, and that's what I've found in the neighborhood that I live in, and it applies to my friends who live in near H Street, is when you truly kind of know where you live, like your block, and you know people's names, and even more than that, you know where they come from and their story and their backgrounds. That really does help in terms of safety too, because you care about each other, you have an affinity toward each other, and you can start to kind of look out for each other. And a big reason why I love DC is because you really do get to know your neighbors, and you really kind of become like family in a way, depending on which neighborhood you live in. And I think that is prevalent within the residences of H Street. And hopefully that's happening in some of the big apartment buildings that have gone up as well.
No, my friends who live in H Street, they would say the exact same thing that you've just articulated. My friend once made a cake for 4th of July, and she just put it on a tray and just walked it down the street to her friend's house for the party. It does seem to be a very sort of community-oriented thing happening there that I think is kind of part of the larger, often untold part of living in DC and living on H Street.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the big, H Street is widely known, obviously, around the city. But one of the largest, if not the largest and the most popular neighborhood festivals is now the H Street Festival. And from when I first started going to it many years ago, it has completely changed and evolved. And it's a big thing. And as I've aged and have an 8-year-old daughter, it could be a bit much. But what I actually love is, because we have some of our dear friends who live just off of H Street, is that if you go to the H Street Festival, you definitely like respectfully wander the streets just north and south of H Street, because that's where a lot of neighbors are doing like barbecue, or some will do yard sales because of to capitalize on the traffic of the festival, or they'll sell lemonade. And that's where you'll get the real sense for the neighborhood that is surround H Street. So if you go to the H Street Festival, definitely spend time wandering the side streets to get a feel of the true community that happens.
Okay, so this is a great segue into one of my questions that I've been excited to ask both of you. What are your favorite things to do in the H Street area?
Honestly, there's so many. So I love creating like guides, and the H Street area guide can be so long. But some of my favorites is, actually one of my favorite coffee shops is there called Sidamo. And it's an Ethiopian coffee shop. They're very iconic. There's a massive kind of kettle as its as part of its sign, and they'll do Ethiopian coffee ceremonies on Sundays, and the owners are very kind, and it's been around for a long time, since the 90s, I believe, and so that is one of my favorite places, because it feels like it has not changed in a very long time, especially when the block around it has. And so it's kind of like stuck in time and in the best of ways. So definitely, I love Sidamo. There's some really good, long time restaurants that have been there, and bars. So I really do love a cocktail. And Copycat is one of my favorite cocktail bars in the city. When I talk to bartenders at other bars, they often say that when they are not working, they go to Copycat for a good cocktail.
Copycat is, I don't live very close to H Street, but it is worth getting in an Uber or getting into a cab or getting on a city bike to check out if you've not been there, for sure. I think it has like, people who don't live in DC have asked me about it.
Yeah. Oh, it is great. They do an excellent job. And it's like a smaller space, but they have kind of an outdoor courtyard in the back. That's beautiful. And it's just like a vibe. And if you go, always ask for the bartender choice, which in my opinion is the truest test of a bar worth their salt. And at least for my palate, they nail it every single time. And so and then there's a lot of other ones, like there's Jerk at Night, which is a popular Caribbean restaurant. A restaurant that actually is near where I live. They closed down the location where I live, and now they relocated to off of H Street. It's called Open Crumb. And it's a great guy named Peter who owns that. And his parents had owned a West African restaurant previously, a long time ago in D.C. And it's a mix of West African food with really good and affordable fried fish sandwiches and fried chicken sandwiches. The Little Grand is a great pizza spot. Ethiopic is a great Ethiopian restaurant. A newer restaurant that I've been surprised by, because I've not seen a lot of like press around it, is called Tiki Garden Thai Street Food. And it is phenomenal. Like, it really is. It's kind of like, it's very unassuming, and you walk in and they do an excellent job. I always get the chicken green curry, and they nail it every single time. So then you have like a lot of newcomers, but a lot of old long-standing places like the Queen Vic, Keto. When I lived around the corner, I used to go to Keto quite often. And then there's just a lot of hyper-local things, like there's a farmer's market through Fresh Farm on Saturdays. Solid State Books is a great local bookstore, and it's one of their biggest locations along H Street. So there's then, of course, Atlas Performing Arts Center as well. And there are several art galleries and tons of murals, which I'm a huge fan of. So honestly, there's so much to find. And then there's actually a lot of alley art too, just to the north of actual H Street.
Maybe a couple things I'd add, because I think Austin is like the person when it comes to like food, restaurants, cocktails. But I think I would say like the H Street Festival is just really worth it. Like, it's the biggest street festival in the city. You'll see people from all over. I think in a time where it seems like there's lots of division and negativity, it's a place of a lot of joy and a lot of diversity, and has been for years and years and years. So the H Street Festival is really fun. There's a set of statehood-themed murals on the side of the Atlas Theater. I think it's the east side of the Atlas Theater. The majority of the murals that went in when the bill went before the house a few years ago. Went in on that side of Atlas. I can't remember the exact year. It might have been, you probably know this, is it 2022 or 2023, something like that. So that comes to mind. I mean, as a minister, I do always think visiting some kind of local house of worship is always a great way to experience a place and get to know people. I've been to Calvary Episcopal and Douglas Memorial as well. So just love what they're doing. And the Atlas Theater has some amazing productions they're always trying to highlight a lot of things happening locally and across the country, bringing voice to things that it's just fun to see in our side of town. I think a lot of theater and things happen in other parts of DC, but to get to have it on the east side of town is really fun.
And another thing I would add is I love alleys in DC because they tell a long story and a very interesting story. But there are alleys that are just beautiful to walk through, that are safe to walk through. And the one behind Atlas Theater is beautiful because of all the murals that Kate mentioned. But one of my favorite places is called Providencia, which is, they do a really good job with cocktails. This will be very annoying to say out loud and publicly, but there are a few places along H Street that are kind of truly hidden and truly secret, that they actually don't want the publicity. And their main goal is really just to gather people in the community. And so if you know, you know, which I hate when people say that.
Wait, Austin, I don't know. Put me on.
I will let you both know after this.
Okay.
But there are some examples like that along H Street, and I say that only because it shows that there are people trying to build this community and kind of spread authentic joy without trying to be known or to be an Instagram hotspot or whatever it is. And that really shows some of the character of H Street and what they've always had throughout their history.
That's actually a great setup for one of the last questions I wanted to ask both of you. If you had to say one overrated and one underrated thing about H Street or on H Street, what would it be?
I would say underrated its history. And even though some of the buildings are gone, there are a number of the historic buildings that remain that you would never know the stories behind it. But once you dig into it, and there's a lot of public photographs of these historic buildings, like Anna Schulman's general store, for example, I think is such a fascinating thing to kind of dig into. So I would say that is underrated. Overrated? Oh, that's a tough question because I really do think everyone has a story to tell. So if I say something that is overrated, I don't want to diminish or take away from what is just a preference for me and may not be for someone else. But overrated, I would say, honestly, maybe the headline that there's so much crime there. I think as you get older and you just know that so much of life is nuanced. And so an area can have some crime, but in the same area, they can also have safety and community and real people with real stories that are working tirelessly to better their block. And so I get why you would report on that, but there is more to the story. And I know people in media know that too, that there's more to the story. But I think that's a responsibility on us as the readers as well, is to kind of read those articles and know, okay, I've been to H Street and this is part of a story, but it's not the headline and it's not all of the story.
That's such a good way to put it, especially as, we've been having conversations about crime in DC for a long time on this show, especially given what's happening with the federal takeover. I think the way that you put it is so right, that we need to, as residents, remember that this is all part of a larger story and not let one small part of the narrative be representative of the entire story. What about you, Kate?
Well, I think I would say basically the exact same thing. I think I would say, yes, overrated. That post story, man, that post story. There was a post story that just said, is H Street over? Or is H Street in decline? I forget the exact headline, but it had ripple effects. And I think a lot of people started to wonder, oh, are businesses closing? Is this place no longer what it was becoming or something like that? But I think restaurants are in a challenging season in our city, in a time after COVID, all of these things. And to pin that kind of comment on an area that I think could really be it can really be impacted by negative media attention. So I think that's one that I feel bummed about because it got so much play as far as like becoming a headline for the area. As far as underrated, I would resonate with the history comment. One thing I wish I had said earlier, we have these wonderful history signs all over H Street that are from the Cultural Tourism Office in D.C. My brother was a history teacher in D.C. when those came out. And so I got to go to some of the premieres of that, along with the National Geographic Society sent us out as I got to be on the educator team to go out and take pictures and pretend we were teaching young people about the signs and just learning more about how those come together. I mean, they are so grassroots, the way those cultural tourism little tours. I mean, they are long tours. That's like a 3-mile walk if you do the whole thing. I think it starts at Union Station. So just really appreciate those. I know I utilize them a lot as a tour guide, but helps bring, particularly in those places where we look at those sites and we say, well, it used to be this like 3 layers ago. The sites help bring a visual that helps us be able to bring that story into the present. So I would recommend the signs to folks and encourage people to stop and read them.
That is a great reminder. I'm feeling really excited to check out H Street more after this conversation. I've been wrestling with whether or not to share this sort of embarrassing story. I think I've shared it on the pod before, but way back when, maybe I was 21 or 22, I went to a place that is no longer there, the Red and Black, to see a show. I'll just say the night didn't go great for anybody, and I was kicked out. And I remember when they kicked me out, they were like, don't come back. And this was like 2007, right? And so I said, and this was before a lot of the bars and restaurants and stuff were really there. So when they said, don't come back, I said, oh, like I would ever be back to H Street. No one's ever going to hang out here. Maybe a year later, it was the hottest spot in DC. How wrong I was.
And here we are, having spoken about H Street for 30 minutes.
Yes, exactly.
That's awesome.
Well, Austin, Kate, thank you so much for being here. I will see you on H Street.
I'll see you on H Street.
That is all for today here on City Cast D.C. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with even more news from around the city. Talk to you then.